Alex Hanser here on this evening of October 24th in the year 2017. I think the spiritual and even cyclical nature of the sun and the changes that it brings our world is often overlooked by mankind. It's something that I have been looking at least for a decade, and who knows? Perhaps many of us have been looking at certain things in other galaxies far, far away, if you will. I don't think it's an accident that we're asking ourselves some of the big questions and looking at some of these causal effects as above, so below. So, what I'm going to be doing for you tonight is going through the ebook, which was produced recently. There's a link down below to purchase it. It's also available for free for those that are subscribers on demand. And I'm also willing to share it to others. But you can also just take notes. You can also Google, right, and directly go to the source as you listen to this. I am going to show the visual at this time of the ebook. So I want to begin by letting you know that this was written around the period of March 2013, and it has not been modified except for brief spelling check and adding citations and adding image to text. The images were made between March and April of 2017 or 13. And I traveled then from Costia County, where I had my first off-grid experience, maybe a few months, maybe 5 months into it, no internet. And I was able to muster the focus to put together this presentation. So I'm happy to share it with you now. I don't know how much information, but we are going to go over solar maximum and the links to cycles of war, societal change, and personal transformation of consciousness. Okay, so this is 2013, and we will begin with a preface. This ebook was completed in April of 2013 while living off the grid in Costia County, Colorado, with little to no resources other than my spirit and enough juice to power my laptop. As I check my laptop power now, just had the generator on earlier tonight. On April 27th, 2013, as I said, I traveled from Colorado to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to present this information at the Free Your Mind conference. My intention was to produce this ebook sooner, but a period of home-free living complicated some of those goals until only recently. The stories of my travels out of a major city, that would be Portland, Oregon, and on my own land in Colorado will be told in another written work now that I'm settled on my own acre in southwest Colorado. You will notice some areas speculating upon the impact of Sunspot Cycle 24, of which has now passed. There will be additional follow-up reports that I will be producing later on the Sunspot Cycle 25 as it emerges out of the current solar minimum, which is expected to bring an increase in cosmic rays to Earth. So there's an importance in preserving my thoughts on the subject that were created at that time, and to note that it was completed during a period in which I was more exposed to the sun than I'd ever been before, while at a much higher elevation, 6,500 feet, instead of being at sea level in Portland, where I'm from. I felt in my soul this information needed to reach society to help it understand the many ways in which we are affected by factors most are unaware of. I look forward to seeing this information reaching the people that it needs to and producing future reports. Thank you for your support. So we're going to be going over a number of issues. Let's see what we're able to get through. We will probably take this in chunks. There's no way that I'm getting through all of that. So I'm going to go ahead and do this as a part one. And there's probably going to be more than 5 parts. So let us begin. And again, all this was written in 2013. It's an honor of mine to present this area of research as we approach the first stages of the peak of Sunspot Cycle 24, which is expected to be a cycle leading into more unpredictable cycles that will affect the Earth and all living beings in ways that we haven't seen for some time. The cycles of the sun are greatly impacting the reality that surrounds us, as well as our biology and state of mind throughout time and civilization. We are currently going through a cycle, Sunspot Cycle 24, that is going to bring a lot of change to our society. Fortunately, this area of research about how the sun impacts the Earth, climate, and human behavior still remains widely unknown. However, today there's a vast amount of historical data available which details the dramatic changes taking place on the planet and all living beings during periods of solar maximums, and that is where solar activity reaches its peak. This information is an examination of how the 11 on average year cycles of the sun brings our planet diverse change through increased earthquakes, natural disasters, extreme weather patterns, climate changes, disruptions to power grids, new ideas, directions, and movements in society, and changes in human expression and behavior. And that includes personal transformations and spiritual awakenings. We will also examine the correlations of battles, beginning between nations launching wars of aggression, or the rise of fascist states, by examining a 2,500-year timeline of solar maximums throughout human history. This would include examples of what we would identify to be, quote, staged, managed events that are created in order to frighten, anger, or traumatize the population during times where the human societal energy has the greatest potential to evolve on a conscious level. Some of the largest protest movements, riots, and general abstract resistance to authority or control can be found during these times. Essentially, we are going to be applying, quote, pattern recognition by comparing the trends with solar flares, major events, staged and naturally occurring, and societal change, including personal transformation. This is the purpose of this presentation. It is to supplement what a lot of you may already have learned about, number one, the NWO, or the New World Order, and the occultic practice of staging events in conjunction with particular celestial occurrences. Number two, the potential for a dramatic expansion of our consciousness and spiritual evolution in this new cycle of time and energy that we are now in. Understanding the cycles of the sun and the change that it brings leads one out of a polarized, linear worldview of an outcome that points to one of two extremes. And bear with me for a moment. And it may just be a loading issue. There is another slide. But where this goes to from this particular point, one of two extremes. That we're going to be saved or we're all going to die, to sum it up. Right? So we see the conspiratorial dark side and other things of that nature, especially disinformation. And then we see, just a lot of people waiting for the whole world to wake up. And I'm seeing how it's a lot more abstract than the extremes in which a lot of people are anticipating that society will go in certain directions. Okay, so a couple acknowledgments that I also made, a couple other individuals and researchers along the yellow brick road of life, basically that have dropped some great information. Carol Moore, Maurice Cotterell, Alfred Weber, Alexander Chavinsky, Raymond Wheeler, Dr. Brill Payne, Mitch Petros. The website spaceweather.com and spaceweather.gov. Dedication of these individuals to this research and knowledge has paved the road for some of us to more easily put the puzzle pieces together in this great mystery before us to come to our own conclusions and deeper understanding of the cosmic influences over our lives and planet. I'm merely a messenger of this information, passing it on. This presentation is a condensed summary and a weaving together of facts, clues that I've stumbled upon at different stages throughout my life. A little bit of background. First major report that I put together, article, was actually published in a physical Australian magazine. And the article, which you can read for free online or at alexansary.tv, is entitled Solar Cycles and Earth's Weakening Magnetic Field. Written on my 29th birthday. So this marked a period of a new direction of research that I was looking into at that time, marking a new path that I was taking in my own personal understanding of the larger picture, beyond politics, beyond the norm, and a deeper understanding of the phrase as above, so below. So my interest in this area of research ironically took off right as the solar cycle took off, as solar cycle 24 began. So I would note that to be again around February of 2009, and the solar cycle really began a few years later. So I was looking at it a little bit in advance. The following is a review of some of the scientifically grounded background information on the changes taking place in our universe with a focus on our sun. This overview will set the preface to understanding the information that'll come later. Overview of the sun. It constitutes 99% of the mass in our solar system and is estimated to be 4.6 billion years old. All life that is on Earth came from the sun, which is the closest star to Earth. If there were no sun, there would be no life on this Earth as we know it. The sun is a giant electromagnetic broadcaster, which floods the planets of the solar system with heat, light, UV radiation, and electrically charged particles. Solar flares in the solar wind containing electrons and protons have shaped life on our planet throughout history, and the changes in the sun's activity affects every person on our planet in some way. Every 10 to 11 years, the number of sunspots found on our closest star rises from 0 to a high of over 400. There is an average 3-year period of increasing solar activity, during which time the sun's north and south poles flip. By the way, I believe that after I wrote this, by about 6 months, during the polar vortex, right, of late 2013, yeah, I remember traveling during some really cold temperatures from Costilla County, Colorado on Greyhound to Kansas City. But back to this report. These cycles affect many things, ranging from weather patterns to botanical life on Earth, to Earth changes, human behavior, and a lot more. Solar flares or coronal mass ejections are eruptions that come from sunspot regions, which are large, dark blotches that periodically appear on the sun's surface. Spikes in sunspots can be periodically, or predicted rather, with some accuracy for 27 days because our sun has a 27-day rotational period. So the same side of the sun is turned to us every 27 days. Solar flares and CMEs travel 93 million miles to reach the Earth at a speed of 1,000,000 miles per hour. And by the way, if there are multiple solar flares back to back to back, right, the amount of time necessary for that solar flare to get to the Earth is shortened to maybe only in a few days rather than the typical expected time, which is 72 hours on average. The solar flares that periodically impact our Earth's magnetic field vary in strength and size depending on which cycle the sun is in, the strength of the magnetic field, and other factors. So with regards to the magnetic field, we'll start with just a basic introduction. Okay, our planet's magnetic field, or magnetosphere, is one of the most complex variables known. It varies with the sun's activity, the sun's rotation, the moon's rotation, the Earth's rotation, and the positions of the planet. This field is a bubble of magnetism that surrounds the Earth and protects us from solar wind, diverting most particles into a circular path around the Earth. Looking back at the image here, towards the poles. The poles here. Magnetic fields, circular motion around the Earth. It's interesting because we have a field around the human body. And that's not something that a lot of people recognize yet. There's still a lot of things people don't understand about these energies. This bubble of protection also protects us from asteroids, comets, and other forms of harmful radiation from space. When hit with a solar flare, our planet's magnetic field absorbs the impact, wiggles and jiggles in the process. This reaction is called a geomagnetic storm. You can monitor those at spaceweather.com and .gov. The loading of the magnetosphere was solar plasma, and the collision, that's a word we should be familiar with now, Russian collusion, collision, and the collision with gas atoms in the atmosphere is what causes the beautiful Aurora Borealis, commonly seen in the northern latitude areas, although in recent years they have been seen more often in south latitude areas. The magnetic field is powered by the rapidly churning liquid core that scientists believe to be made of iron. So, this is a chart from a couple years ago, and they were projecting where 2012 would go, as you can see here. These two right here would mark the double peak, and we did see a double peak. We'll get there. We'll get there. It's all here. So, again, we are looking at this as this was written from 2013, okay, 4 years ago. Sunspot Cycle 24 began around 2008. And at the time, NASA projected that the cycle would begin its peak around May 2013. It's also debatable when it actually kicked off, because we do see sunspots spread out throughout a cycle. Philip T. revised his projection from the NASA website to a projection of a possible double peak in late 2013 and sometime in 2015. And so, yes, here in 2017, looking back, you can look it up. We did see a double peak of this last cycle. So this was a accurate projection. Sunspot Cycle 24 was previously predicted by computer models to be one of the strongest in centuries, specifically 30 to 50% stronger than the last one, which began almost a year late. The estimate came from a computer model of solar dynamics developed by scientists at the U.S. National Center for Atmospheric Research, or NCAR. The scientists have confidence in the forecast because, in a series of test runs, the newly developed model simulated the strength of the past 8 solar cycles with more than 98% accuracy. The forecasts are generated in part by tracking the subsurface movements of the sunspot remnants of the previous 2 solar cycles. And according to scientific data, extreme solar storms occur about once in every 5 centuries, but events with half the intensity happen every 50 years. So most of you have already heard about NASA's concern, and the government really, about a repeat of the 1859 Carotene Event. And there are some people that are actually just now talking about this. NASA has confirmed the level of vulnerability that the current power grid faces if a massive solar storm hit the Earth and made its way through our Earth's magnetic field. The weakening of the Earth's magnetic field and moving of magnetic north is another factor of concern. They are sounding an alarm because the North American continent is so close to the North Magnetic Pole, and that makes it the most vulnerable to solar activity. Between August 28th and September 2nd, 1859. And by the way, think about how many years away the Civil War was. And as you'll notice later on the presentation, as we go through the charts, right, where we were in the solar cycle when the Civil War was taking place. And it wasn't very far away from this event. Kind of a coincidence. So during that period, numerous sunspots and solar flares were observed on the sun. Just before noon on September 1st, the British astronomer Richard Carrington observed the largest solar flare, which caused the major coronal mass ejection. to travel towards Earth, taking 17.6 hours. Such a journey normally takes 3 to 4 days. The second CME moves so quickly because the first one had cleared through the ambient solar wind plasma, as I mentioned earlier, speeding them up. Auroras were seen around the world, even over the Caribbean. It was the worst solar storm in the past 200 years, or most intense, because we can look at another way. These are natural. This is nature. So this event has been coined the Carotene Event, named after the astronomer that discovered the flare. Between September 1st and the 2nd of 1859, the largest recorded geomagnetic storm occurred, and lights across North America went dark as the nation's telegraph wire system, that was their grid system at the time, a telegraph wire system, which was hit with a massive solar flare. Telegraph systems all over Europe and North America failed, hit by a surge in power. Telegraph paper spontaneously caught fire and in some cases shocked telegraph operators. Even when telegraphers disconnected the batteries powering the lines, Aurora-induced electric currents in the wire still allowed messages to be transmitted. Auroras were seen around the world, even over the Caribbean. The aurora over the Rocky Mountains were so bright that their glow had awakened gold miners who began preparing breakfast because they thought it was morning. People who happened to be awake in the northeastern U.S. could read a newspaper by the aurora's light. By the way, I haven't seen that I know of the Aurora Borealis for a long, long time. Maybe in Portland years ago, but yeah, in Colorado, where I am in southern Colorado, it's less likely to see it down here. If we start seeing it in certain areas, as my interview with Matthew Stein, not to get too far off track, that could be a warning sign for a threat to the grid once we start seeing extended auroras in areas that we don't normally see them. The instruments used to record this magnetic fluctuation across the world went off the scales, and this is referencing my own article from 2009 in Nexus. It was perhaps the worst solar storm in the past 200 years. Its results for humankind were small because civilization had not yet entered a high-tech phase of development. But with the advent of modern power grids and satellites, much more is at risk. If we experience something similar in our modern age, our civilization and our way of life would be altered beyond most people's wildest imaginations, making something like this very difficult to prepare for, especially in an urban environment where most humans reside today. Numerous scientific studies confirm the threat. Meditech Corporation, U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, made up of scientists from NASA and NOAA. There is a consensus that this event could create a cascade of failures that would sweep across the U.S., cutting power to 130 million or more in this country alone. Other vital systems, like nuclear power plants and some aspects of military defense, could be affected with an estimated cost of $2 trillion. The U.S. National Academy of Sciences has outlined a series of grand possibilities on Earth for a worst case scenario solar storm happening again. Modern power grids are so interconnected that a big space storm, the type expected to occur about once a century, could cause a cascade of failures that would sweep across the United States, cutting power to 130 million people or more in this country alone. This report concludes. Okay, look, I had a double there. At the meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in the winter of 2011, leading scientific authorities representing NASA and NOAA, they warned that a solar storm directed at our planet could bring about a global Katrina, costing the world economy $2 trillion. The participants urged preparation for solar storms, noting an uptick in solar activity over the last year, a trend that they predict will peak in 2013. The group of scientists emphasized that our modern technology increasingly is dependent on satellites, is more vulnerable to geomagnetic storms than even a decade ago. About 100 emergency officials in April 2012 gathered in Florida, Melbourne, to discuss the impact of solar storms in the state. The overall, and I'd be curious about why that is, just in general, or more than likely, Florida's proximity on the planet. And maybe, as I've mentioned before in other videos, solar flares affecting certain parts of the planet more than others. The overall message of the meeting was that Florida, along with the rest of the U.S., remains largely vulnerable to an intense solar storm. The keynote speaker at the event was William Bryan, Deputy Assistant Secretary at the United States Department of Energy, who remarked to the group that we know it's going to happen. We just don't know when. How big will the event be? We don't know that. Dr. Robert, and I don't want to butcher the name, a Yale-educated geophysicist and professor of geology at the College of General Studies at Boston University, told the Progressive Radio Network on January 11th, 2013, that there is strong scientific evidence suggesting that the sun is building up to a especially volatile point in a cycle that occurs only every 10 to 12,000 years. I just want to pause right now, and I think that that's something that I think that we could possibly see in the next solar cycle. It wasn't necessarily the 2012 Sunspot Cycle 24, now that it's 4 years later. And we're going to be hearing projections pretty soon now. We don't go into a minimum, really, until 2020. Start looking at, projections and things that they'll be releasing, but NASA may be holding on to certain projections. There may be a lot of concern, by the way, at the part of government, getting back to this, regarding what they're seeing in the future, truly. He commented that we are likely entering a period of extreme activity on the sun, which can have incredible effects on the Earth and the surface of the Earth and organisms living on the surface of the Earth. The increase in CMEs and solar proton events will hasten, according to him, climate change patterns on the planet. Here's one: speeding up the melting of glaciers at high latitude. Something really, really intense then could trigger a pole shift. That's true. That's possible, I believe. Anyway, and increasing volcanic and seismic activity. Speaking about the lack of media attention given to solar storms, he said the American press tends to keep everyone happy and docile and uninformed to avoid inciting panic among the public. Oh, but sometimes they like to. Speaking with National Geographic News, Daniel Baker of the University of Colorado's Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics told National Geographic News that a powerful solar storm could effectively leave entire cities without power for months or even years. He noted that the large transformers that would likely be blown out during a solar storm are in short supply, a fact that can lead to severe complications when trying to restore power. There's currently a 6-month to 2-year waiting list for purchase replacements. This is key for these electric transformers, which are manufactured in China and India and also other places, I believe South Africa. Not totally sure on that one. Nuclear power plants remain unprepared, though, for what could be coming. The grid were to fail during a solar event, the cooling system and nuclear plants would not be able to function, triggering a meltdown if the plants were cut off from fuel for a prolonged period of time. As it sits right now, backup generators fueled by diesel are estimated to only have enough fuel for several days. Now, I don't know if they've changed this in the last 4 years since I put all this together. I don't think they're really prepared. There's an argument to be made that they're not really going to prepare the population, but they're preparing themselves. And that many governments are preparing for an event other than world war. And it could be this or things that relate to this I just want to let the audience know, I think there might be some heavy disinformation to steer people away from stuff like this and to do a lot of disinformation, fake space news and theories, such as flat Earth, possibly Nibiru Planet X theories or hoaxes. We're certainly seeing people invoking fears of Planet X on a regular basis, and even using the image of the sun itself to talk about Planet X. But that's just weird to use an image of the sun to just change the topic. So there's a lot of humans amongst us that are drawn to like some really bizarre fluff that has no basis in real science. But this is something that people need to be aware of, especially those concerned about radiation poisoning, especially those concerned about Fukushima. So one of the biggest concerns is for the potential for these plants to go into meltdown, situation where they have no fuel for a prolonged period in time. Matthew Stein, from his article 400 Chernobyls, produced 2011. Nuclear power plants function through the process of nuclear fission. This process utilizes radioactive material, such as uranium, to boil water at very high temperatures. This, in turn, creates steam to power turbines, and that generates electric power. All the while, a constant stream of coolants is introduced via electric pumps to prevent the radioactive fuel from overheating and melting the fuel rods. In most nuclear reactors, the pumps run on power from the grid, and it's not self-sustaining. If the electric grid were to fail during a solar event, the cooling system in plants, the nuclear plants would not be able to function. Okay, so would not be able to use backup generators for longer than a certain period of time. In most nuclear plants, the batteries last about 8 hours, while the generators fueled by diesel will keep the system operational for 72 hours. If the electric power grid is still not restored after the contingency power sources have been exhausted, a nuclear meltdown will occur. To safely shut down a reactor requires months of circulating coolant throughout the system. At the moment, virtually all of the approximately 700 nuclear reactors worldwide would be unable to execute a proper cool-down situation if the grid were to fail. 2010 report set forth by the Oak Ridge National Laboratory stated that among the 104 reactors in the U.S., 71 are found in areas where power collapse would likely occur in the event of a solar storm. Given the available data, it is not unreasonable to suggest that a considerable solar storm could trigger a series of devastating nuclear meltdowns across the world. So we've seen, by and large, government in action. And the question is why? So back in June, the House of Reps voted unanimously in favor of the Grid Reliability and Infrastructure Defense Act, or H.R. 5026, which was aimed at taking steps to protect the grid, the U.S. grid, from a solar storm. When it was introduced in the Senate, the bill was stripped of all references to protecting the power grids. And it's been estimated only costs about $100 million. Now, before Obama left office, an executive order was created, and I would just simply assume that that is just handing the government more control. But to a certain degree, it would make sense for the government, as we'll get into in just a minute, to be panicked about their Tower of Babel potentially on the brink of collapsing. We have economic threats, geopolitical, and changes in the sun. It seems that our civilization's up for a reset. The Senate has failed to act on this issue. A report released by Russia's Federal Atomic Energy Agency in the fall of 2011 reveals that the government has issued emergency notices to the directors of the country's nuclear power plants regarding the potential impact of solar storms. Think about a lot of these power plants on the East Coast and certain areas, and be aware if they are close to you and if you may need to evacuate at some point in the future. Other large solar flares in recent history, keep this in context, nothing new, it's been happening. 1960, November 13th, Solar flares disrupted the Earth's geomagnetic fields, upsetting the operation of radio stations. In 1989, a relatively weak geomagnetic storm caused an accident at a Canadian hydroelectric power plant that left 6 million people in the United States and Canada without power for 9 hours. In May of 93, a solar flare affected ATM machines in Massachusetts. I had to scratch my head that one going, really? ATM machines in 1993? I was 13 then. Several large solar flares have already caused disruption on our planet in the recent past, which has NASA on alert. There's also been record coronal mass ejections, or CMEs, captured from the sun recently that could have affected our planet if it was Earth directed, and especially in the case of a 2012 solar flare. That could have been a kill shot if it was Earth directed. The Discovery Space Shuttle was impacted by showing bizarre instrument readings, and the mission was nearly aborted. The upper atmosphere expanded and increased drag on NASA's long duration exposure facility satellite, which carried valuable specimens of material in space exposure tests. NASA recovered LDEF before it could re-enter the atmosphere. So going down here, other events in which technology has been disrupted by solar flares. Now, this is interesting to me, this period of 2003, because a little bit of personal trivia, I pulled my sciatic nerve around the same time period of the solar flare, which ironically put me on a cane for the first time in my life and only time in my life. And I find that to be very interesting that I pulled a nerve, or a sciatic nerve, pretty close to this event. I'm not sure how many days, but definitely within several weeks, absolutely, of this solar flare. On October 28th, 2003, an X72 and X10 solar flare interfered with satellite communications, and it produced a brief power outage in Sweden and lit up the skies with ghostly auroras as far south as Florida and Texas. Now, hang on. We'll get into the war cycles later. You remember when the war started in Iraq, for example? When they, not the first time, but the first time was also during the solar flare cycle. Absolutely. 1990, 1991. We'll get there. But they went into Iraq March of 2003. By this period, when all these solar flares, war was just raging as they were still pushing inward. So this was also a very bloody time on the planet. Keep this in mind, because you're not going to hear this from other researchers into the arena of solar cycles. They usually try to keep things, in the realm of science and not get political. But I'm going to be the person that's going to show you the trends. On September 7th, 2005, a string of X-class solar flares, including X17, caused lesser disruptions to major power grids and knocked out the GPS system completely for 10 minutes. Now, do you remember what happened then? In 5, 4, 3, 2, Hurricane Katrina. Solar flares and storms, we're going to get there. On June 7th, 2011, a moderate solar flare caused minor satellite disruptions. And yes, they call it the Halloween storm of 2003. Unexpected deep solar minimum revises NASA forecasts. So looking back at 2008 to 2011, and also how they were looking at sunspot cycles then, at that time, and projecting 2012, quiet before the storm, I almost think like low sperm count, low sunspot count. But if you think there's not a correlation, if you know what I mean, between certain things and the sun, you would be wrong. I would say that there is. So looking at the spotless sun, blankest years of the last century, notice how we had the Federal Reserve in 1913 created, and we saw the banker bailouts of 2008. Not a lot of opposition either time. Of course, they didn't really know better in 1913. Oh, they did by 2008. But it was a delayed reaction. Notice how Occupy Wall Street protests didn't begin until there was an increase in actual sunspots in late 2011, which is really when the sunspot cycle kicked off. I mean, there were solar flares earlier, and even during a minimum, there are periodic sunspots, and thus solar flares, and thus geomagnetic storms. Despite high expectations for an active Sunspot Cycle 24, this last one that we just came out of at the time of writing, there's been a considerable delay in the intensity of the rise, causing some scientists to speculate if we are in fact going into a deep minimum over time, which could trigger a period of global cooling instead of global warming. This scenario could create famine and starvation worldwide due to shorter growing seasons and harsher weather. This could lead to a decline in population. In 2009 or 2008, sunspots almost completely disappeared for 2 years. Solar activity dropped to 100-year lows. There were no sunspots observed on 266 of the 366 days or 365 days of 2008. To find a year with more blank suns, you got to go all the way back to 1913, which had 311 spotless days. Sunspot counts for 2009 have dropped even lower. Now, according to NASA, the sun's global magnetic field weakened in 2008, 2009, and the solar wind subsided, setting a 50-year record low in solar wind pressure. Measurements by the don't want to butcher that name either, but one of the spacecrafts they've got up there reveals a 20% drop in solar wind pressure since the mid-1990s, the lowest point since such measurements began in the 1960s. The solar wind helps keep the galactic cosmic rays out of the inner solar system. And by the way, there's been new articles you're going to read about this since I wrote this, about how solar flare is actually good for our planet. You know, it's good for keeping out the harmful cosmic rays. It's when we have and we might get more into that later with some of the information that I shared from Maurice Cotterell. The solar wind helps keep galactic cosmic rays out of the inner solar system. Okay. So we're going to be dealing with more cosmic rays as we go into the minimum now, minimum by 2020. With the solar wind flagging, the heliosphere isn't as inflated as much as it used to be, which means more cosmic rays will be able to enter the inner solar system. Space became a more dangerous place to travel. When the heating action of UV rays, normally provided by sunspots, is absent, Earth's upper atmosphere began to cool and collapse. Space junk has stopped decaying as rapidly and started acclimating in Earth orbit. Less sunspots equals lower decay rates. So somebody with the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics developed a computer simulation model that illustrates that the issue with weak sunspot counts began in the late 1990s during the upswing of solar cycle 23, when the Great Conveyor Belt, the GCB, was speeding up. A speeding up of the GCB is now associated with less sunspots and vice versa. We will later discuss NASA's projections for an all-time low GCB rate in 2022 and how that may play a part in magnifying this in the next solar cycle. Just another point, I had an assistant help me with some of the citations. All of these citations are pre-2013, and they are linked down below. But she's following a particular, the editor, formula for laying out the particular, and I'm getting tired now, citations. And we went over this. And what I want to do now is go over this quote from Mitch Batros, author of Solar Rain, Earth Changes Has Begun, told Coast to Coast AM on November 26, 2012. Solar Cycle 24 hasn't had the activity that Solar Cycle 23 had. Solar Cycle 23 at its apex, we saw an X flare after an X flare, including the largest X flare ever recorded, an X45. The average observer with a basic working knowledge might be assuming that this is going to be a weak cycle based on what we've seen so far. But here's the trick. There's something else going on that no one's been able to put their finger on, and they are studying it very hard. There seems to be a change in the configuration. That these lower events, this is pretty key information that I'm sharing right here, such as M1 or M5, and think about the solar minimum that we're going into, seems to have the impact of an X-class solar flare. That correlation is transferring to the Earth's core, and that's what's causing these Earth-changing events, such as earthquakes and erupting volcanoes, including the hurricanes and extreme weather of all types. Again, another slide. Earth-changing events linked to solar activity. Mount St. Helens, several months after I was born, 1980, also just outside of Portland, Oregon. San Francisco earthquake, 1989. Hurricane Katrina, as I mentioned, 2005. New Zealand, 2011. Fukushima, 2011. Haiti, 2011. And what have we seen since 2013? And still, to this day, there are many people that do not know the correlation between major changes on the planet, earthquakes, tsunamis, tornadoes, other major natural disasters, and solar flares. That is one of the things that Suspicious Observers specializes in over at his channel. There are new findings that are mirroring the same relationship that the sun and Earth have. That mirrors the relationship between our star, the sun, and our galaxy, and the Milky Way. In the last 24 months, we have seen scientific evidence pouring out that a steam of charged particles emanating out from the center of the galaxy affects all of our galaxy. And this might have actually been a typo, might have been stream of charged particles. But of course, our solar system as well, in turn, that's affecting the sun, and the sun in turn has an effect on all the planets, including the Earth. So I'm looking at the connection between the galaxy and our sun and what the effects of such. Again, we're quoting Mitch Batros from Coast to Coast back in 2012, I believe, or 2011. What is happening as a pulse of charged particles hit the sun and how it's changing the sun, and then what in turn is its effect on Earth, and that takes us to the Earth's core. I actually translated this word for word from some videos that I downloaded off YouTube. So going back and mentioning that it was accurately projected that there'd be a double cycle for Sunspot Cycle 24, or double peak, as we also see that mirror Sunspot Cycle, Solar Cycle 14. Astronomers have been counting sunspots for centuries, and they have found that the cycle is not perfectly regular. The back and forth swing in sunspots can take anywhere from 10 to 13 years to complete. Also, the amplitude of the cycle varies. Pesnell, who is actually with NASA, I believe, just jumped over a line here. Dean Pesnell, solar physicist, leading member of the NOAA Solar Cycle Prediction Panel. He has a different explanation of why we may be experiencing a delay. And again, even though we're talking about a former cycle that we just came out of, all of this science relates because they're still learning rapidly cause and effect from each cycle, from the data. Astronomers have been counting sunspots for centuries, and they found the cycle is not perfectly regular. Also, the amplitude of the cycle varies. Pesnell also notes yet another complication. The last two solar maximum periods, around 89 and 2001, had not one but two peaks. Solar activity went up, dipped, and then resumed, performing a mini cycle that lasted about 2 years. The same thing could be happening now. Sunspots jumped in 2011, dipped in 2012, and Pesnell expects them to rebound again in 2013. He says, quote, I am comfortable saying that another peak will happen in 2013 and possibly in 2014. Another curiosity of this solar cycle is that the sun's hemispheres do not always peak at the same time. So in the current cycle, the south has been lagging behind the north. The second peak, if it occurs, will feature the southern hemisphere playing catch up with a surge of activity south of the equator. Pesnell's new forecast for a double peaked cycle updated the previous forecast of peak in May 2013. A maximum in May now sounds unlikely. He comments, quote, we may be seeing what happens when you predict a single amplitude and the sun responds with a double peak. And here we are. Again, another chart. Incidentally, Pesnell notes a striking similarity between solar cycle 24 and solar cycle 14. If the two cycles are in fact twins, it would mean a late peak in 2014 and another peak in 2015. All right. So I think we've covered this quite well. And my research is still in development, just like the big picture is in development. So this is actually the section in which we are going to close. We're actually going to close on this actual page. The big picture is still in development. Despite congressional inaction on this issue, the government continues to quietly build underground bunkers at an alarming rate, which indicates that they may know more about what's going on with the sun than what they are allowing NASA to reveal to the public. Therefore, we should ask ourselves the following questions. Is there a concern in the upper echelons of government and governments worldwide that their Tower of Babel, because I do see this as a global new world order Roman system, it's a global system, it's not just the US. So are these governments concerned about their Tower of Babel on the brink of collapse? Other questions. Has at any time this government discovered the potential of this event or other disasters with the use of remote viewing or other means? In what specific ways are the powers that be preparing for this event, and how do they intend to maintain a strong, dominant, and controlling position when their technology that's often used to suppress humanity is disrupted? How might a blackout in one part of the planet affect the global power structure, balance of power, or the ability for one nation to attack and wage on another? What kind of consequences could this country face in the event that our power grid is disrupted while China and Russia remain unaffected, especially during the heat of global tensions and threats? You know, our government, because of where we are in the hemisphere, northern hemisphere, they believe that the US, our continent, is more at risk. Also, other studies have been done. China and where it is on the planet is considered to be more stable, their grid. Their vulnerability to a massive solar flare kill shot is not as strong as the US. You can look this up on your own. Do you not think that governments have thought about this? Even how to weaponize certain things? Contemplate this. What kind of changes could we see in human behavior, perceptions, or spiritual interests in the event that people wouldn't be able to watch TV or consume mass media? That would include BoobTube. That would include this. How might such an event have a positive outcome down the line for people seeking freedom from dominating structures and oppressive systems at a moment when governments may not pose the technology or resources to suppress or manipulate them. What kind of changes could we experience economically if our resources rebalance themselves back into the local economy, local currencies, markets, and seeing a new renaissance, if you will, of trade, small business, things like that? Could this potential event be something that leads or levels out populations, produces the population, similar to things that we may have seen in the past? We'll get later on deeper into the rise and fall of civilizations, show you the chart that was created by Maurice Cotterell, author of Future Sciences. Could a king of all solar flare event be a form of divine intervention coming from a creator in order to humble mankind by resetting civilization that the human species has become accustomed to? Finally, how might such an event bring people together in a crisis where friends and loved ones may become more valuable than money or technology? Maybe more will be at play and is at stake than what we currently know. Now, with that, I will see you with part 2.